I'm Don Daler. Our first report from 1999 is the story of a contract killer and con man who for more than 2 decades made an art of outsmarting the law. How could he do it? His gruesome, twisted story leaves us with almost as many questions as answers.
This is the face of a killer who arranged murders for money. His name is Walter Waldhauser. By many accounts, he should have been executed, or at least still be in prison, as the admitted mastermind of 4 murders for hire.
No question about it. He sacrificed people's lives on the altar of greed.
It all began a quarter of a century ago in Houston. Gertrude Zabolio, a wealthy socialite, was the mother of Waldhauser's best friend. Dead, she was worth a lot of money. The son would get her inheritance, which he was supposed to split with Waldhauser. Waldhauser was only 21 when he hired a man to break into her home and strangle her with a pair of pantyhose. It was a cold-blooded murder. But a careless investigation overlooked footprints leading into her home, a mistake that would leave Waldhauser free to kill again, because the death was ruled a suicide, an autoerotic death. Detective Johnny Bonds would investigate the case years later, a case that would become an obsession.
So here is a murder that was committed and passed off as a suicide.
It was passed off as a suicide. It was ruled a suicide, and nobody ever suspected anything else.
Thus began a life of crime. There was nothing in Waldhauser's past to explain his future. He grew up in an affluent Houston neighborhood with well-to-do parents. In high school, he already had a fascination for money. A former classmate was Dr. Robert Smith, now a dentist, and once mayor of Garland, Texas.
We'd be playing ball, he'd be saying he's going to go check out some stocks or...
Stocks?
Oh, right.
Back then?
Yes, that was Walt Waldhauser. The people that knew Walt fairly well would have voted him very well up to the top of most likely to succeed.
Indeed, his legitimate career seemed assured. He was even featured on the cover of the Houston Business Journal for his plans to open a stock exchange in Houston. But Waldhauser also had a dark side. The rich kid from the suburbs liked to brag he was a tough street kid from the hood, as he later told a girlfriend he was pursuing.
I went back to my old neighborhood, and nobody bothered me, of course, because they remember the old days.
Yeah.
Somebody bothered me in the old days, Priscilla. I bothered them back real bad.
Like hell.
Like, well, I didn't kill them, but I ruined their whole day.
Detective Bond says Waldhauser liked to live out his tough guy fantasy.
He tried to pass himself off as an associate of the mafia. Had some people believing he was a mafia attorney.
A mobster, a gangster.
Right.
Why would he do that?
I guess like some people have hobbies, that was his hobby.
Authorities soon discovered he had another sinister hobby, arranging murders for money.
Guilty or not guilty?
Houston Judge Ted Poe was a young prosecutor when he got to know Waldhauser better than he wanted to.
He found the plotting and killing of people much more intriguing than making money legitimately. It was more fun. It was a game. It was an art form in his mind.
After they got away clean with the first murder, Waldhauser and his friend plotted to kill another family for their estate. 4 years later, the targets were the family of his friend's wealthy sister, Diana Wanstroth, and her husband, John, and their 1-year-old baby, Kevin. The family had inherited a lot of money, and Waldhauser and his friend decided to kill them and split their inheritance. But first, they had to eliminate all the heirs, which included the baby. Waldhauser hired the same killer to do the dirty work. From death row, the triggerman, Alan Janeka, later described what happened on the night of July 5th, 1979. He says he went to the house with Waldhauser, whom he refers to as his co-defendant.
And then my co-defendant reached in his coat pocket and brought out a can of mace and sprayed Mr. Wanstroth in the face. And then that's when I got up and walked up behind him and shot him back of the head. From there, my co-defendant sprayed Mrs. Wanstroth in the face with the mace and grabbed a hold of her and threw her down, which then at that time I walked over and put the gun to the side of her head and shot her.
Then the hired killer says Waldhauser ordered him to go into the baby's room and shoot young Kevin and eliminate the last heir to the estate.
And looking at the little fella in the crib, I raised the weapon and pulled the trigger.
Kevin was asleep in his baby bed, blue terry cloth pajamas, curled up to his favorite teddy bear, and he was shot in the back of the head.
For money.
For money, for the love of money.
This time, Waldhauser and his friend became the main suspects. But then there was another incredible blunder. After a 7-month investigation by the medical examiner's office, where a psychiatric expert examined the history of the victims, these killings were ruled a double murder by Mrs. Wanstroth and a suicide, a finding which infuriated police and family friends.
It made no sense. It made absolutely no sense.
Ellen Davidson, a friend of the family, was one of many incredulous people who protested the suicide ruling.
When Diana died, the medical examiner did the most outrageous thing, the most unrealistic, the most unbelievable thing in ruling that Diana had shot her husband and baby and then committed suicide without a weapon in the house.
Did they feel they'd gotten by with murder?
Oh, yeah. None of these were intended to look like anything except what they were, murder.
By 1980, Walter Waldhauser had arranged 4 murders and was still at large, enjoying the profits of his crimes. But Waldhauser was greedy, and the killings had been so easy that he and his partner decided to try again.
They had planned to kill me for the insurance money.
This man, who asked not to be identified, went into business to develop a lakefront property with Waldhauser and his partner. As part of the deal, he took out a $1 million life insurance policy, naming them as beneficiaries. He says they planned to kill him and make it look like an accident.
I was thinking that they were friends all along, but I was nothing more than a dollar sign in their eyes.
But the killing never happened because police finally got a break, which helped them reopen and solve the earlier murders. The triggerman was arrested, confessed, and led them to Waldhauser. But just when he seemed cornered, Waldhauser wiggled out of it again. He struck a plea bargain. He would help the state send his pals to death row in return for a prison term of 30 years.
We expected him to serve most of that 30 years, and none of that happened. He served 9 years on 3 30-year sentences.
This murder indictment naming Waldhauser was flawed. It failed to state that a deadly weapon had been used in the commission of the crime. Thus, he became eligible for early parole. And because he had been a model inmate, he was released.
Of course he would be a model inmate. He could run the penitentiary. He could run the penitentiary and make a profit for the state of Texas. He was that smart.
After his release, he cleverly took a whole new identity. He went before a judge and changed his name. It was all legal. Then he began a whole new life of scheming, deception, and profiteering. He slipped away to Arizona, where he mingled with the co-eds and law students at Arizona State University Law School.
Apparently, it was a kind of a game to him.
Kyle Israel was Waldhauser's law school classmate. He took these home movies of his pal during graduation.
Best memory from law school was having the foresight to hire a good attorney.
But he didn't fool everyone. He completed law school and was ready to take the bar exam before his earlier identity as Walter Waldhauser was discovered, and he was booted out without his degree.
Here he was able to fool the top 3 or 4% of some of the people that you might meet on the streets, and to him that was probably rewarding enough.
Soon he was on the prowl again. Destination Dallas, home of big deals and fast money. Now he was Michael Davis, insurance man, mingling with the movers, shakers, and deal makers downtown. And before long, officials say, he hatched a scheme to resell bogus insurance policies.
I never did see any money, never did see the policy.
Lily Faust, a 91-year-old Texas widow who lives alone with her pets, bought an insurance policy from a representative of Waldhauser's company last year. She'd later find it was worthless.
And I paid him $20,000.
$20,000?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a substantial amount of money.
You darn right. I could use it.
Lily was more fortunate than some. Dozens invested millions of dollars. Now officials say it's all gone, and Waldhauser made off with nearly $2 million of their dollars.
And how do you feel?
I think it's dirt.
So how could a dangerous killer out on parole move around and fool people so easily? For him, it was no trouble because the state's overburdened parole system was so easy to con. He was only required once a year to send this postcard form to his parole officers. They only knew what he told them. He was an unemployed student, and no one bothered to check.
And the parole board blew it. They absolutely blew it.
Ellen Davidson, the friend of the family that Waldhauser arranged to have murdered, was one of many people who tried to get parole officials to keep him on a tight leash.
The parole board did just a horrible job. They did not watch him closely enough.
Had they known, they would have found life was good for Waldhauser. He bought a house in the suburbs, authorities say with cash, got married, had neighbors and friends and birthday parties. He seemed like a model husband and businessman. But his fortunes changed when state insurance detectives say they broke his scam.
This is the News 8 Update.
Good evening. A convicted murderer who time and time again has beaten the legal justice system nearly slips through a crack again.
In June, Waldhauser was indicted along with 31 others in the insurance case. The police went to his home to arrest him and used a battering ram to break down the front door. But Waldhauser was gone, thus leaving behind his wife, his home, and his business.
This guy basically outsmarted the state of Texas on every turn.
He may have, but Tom, I think you're being quite unfair.
Glenn Castleberry speaks for the Texas Parole Division that's taking a lot of heat about the Waldhauser case. He says his agency just can't keep up.
We don't have the kind of law enforcement investigative resources to go tracking 24 hours a day every one of the 100,000 people we have on parole.
There was a reported sighting of Waldhauser in London. The international cops, Interpol, and the FBI were conducting a worldwide manhunt. Just when authorities were losing hope of finding Waldhauser, he fooled them once again. When here in Dallas, he simply walked into the police department and surrendered. Why? Well, sources close to the case say he was expecting to cut a new deal for leniency. But there was no deal. This time, Waldhauser apparently made the mistake. And after 25 years of blunders by Texas authorities, they vow there won't be any this time. They plan to throw the book at him and hopefully end a string of mistakes that made murders seem like suicides, that let a killer out of prison early to get a new identity so he could prosper while hiding his dark past. But Waldhauser doesn't see it that way.
I've made a lot of money. I've been a success in my own right, and I did it the hard way.
In 2000, Walter Waldhauser was convicted on 5 counts of insurance fraud and 1 count of money laundering. He was sentenced to 6 60-year prison terms. In his more than 20-year career as a criminal, Waldhauser was able to exploit an overburdened Texas legal system. Many fear his experience is not uncommon. In 1997, the state of Florida found itself forced to release hundreds of dangerous criminals before they'd completed their sentences. The releases were part of a program called Gain Time, which was created in the 1980s to ease Florida's problems with prison overcrowding. Under Gain Time, prisoners could earn as much as 2 months' credit towards early release for every month they served in prison. The state tried to end the program in 1992, but the U.S. Supreme Court sided with an inmate's lawsuit.
We have a judge and a jury system that gives the time and takes care of that business. That's not left up to the politicians to change that in midstream.
So in March of 1997, the early releases resumed. Among the first 300 felons to go free were robbers, rapists, and even some murderers, like Larry Schutz, convicted in 1989 of stabbing his mother 24 times.
He is completely dangerous, and the state of Florida is releasing him back into society.
It's not if he's going to hurt somebody, it's when.
Other early releases included prisoners like Dean Dameron, convicted of burglary, abduction, and first-degree murder. Given 2 life sentences, Dameron's early release left his neighbors feeling very uneasy.
They're being released too soon, in my estimation. We've got a lot of older people living here that can't defend themselves, or women like me.
Public outcry eventually led to changes in the gain time policy. And although the early releases do continue, all prisoners sentenced after October 1st, 1995 must now serve at least 85% of their sentence. And those receiving a life sentence must serve life. Our next report from 2000 concerns a man we first examined 10 years ago, Dr. Michael Swango. Back then, Dr. Swango was about to be released from prison after serving 2 years for poisoning his coworkers. Some believed he was innocent. Others thought he was still dangerous. Few could have imagined that today Michael Swango would be considered one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. That's right behind me. Okay.
When Dr. Michael Swango makes the rounds, patients seem to die unexpectedly. Investigators suspect he's murdered a dozen people, maybe more. People who know him say Swango's brilliant, dangerous, and a really nice guy.
He was very gregarious and charming, and many psychopaths are like that.
13 years ago, Judge Dennis Cashman presided over Swango's trial for poisoning 5 of his co-workers.
I thought I was going to die. I thought my head was going to explode.
Lonnie Long, Brent Unmisig, and Swango were working together as paramedics here in Quincy, Illinois, when Swango secretly spiked their donuts, tea, and soda with ant poison. That's basically sugar and arsenic.
Mike would call on the phone and ask questions of my symptoms. How many times had I vomited? He'd even ask questions on what color my vomit was.
There were other signs that Swango was fascinated by poison and death. After he was caught poisoning the paramedics, Illinois police went to his house to search for evidence. They found kitchen cabinets stacked not with food, but with poisons, all kinds, and books that showed different ways to kill people. There was ant poison, gopher poison, insect poison, mouse poison. The rest were chemicals to make poison, and syringes. But to me, the most damning find was the recipe cards. You don't find these in most kitchens. This one's for ricin, a poison which at the time was virtually impossible to detect. He also had castor beans, which are used to make ricin. Still, all this evidence was just circumstantial, and as far as the prosecution knew, no one had died, so they just charged Swango with aggravated battery. Judge Cashman sentenced him to the maximum that charge allows, just 5 years.
Did you think that would be the end of it? Not really. There was nothing about him that suggested to me that this was a one-time event. It was something that was in his being.
Did he make you nervous, personally?
He made me uneasy just because he was so cold.
I have no excitement over human suffering and death. None whatsoever.
I met Swango in prison while he was serving time for poisoning the paramedics. He was appealing the verdict, claiming the evidence was tainted.
I'm a fighter, and I hope that we can show that a tragic mistake has been made.
Why all the poisons in your house?
There were not a lot of poisons in my house.
There was the ant poison and the gopher poison and rodent poison and mouse poison and cyanide and...
No, sir. No, sir. There was no cyanide in my house, and I strongly... No, sir. I strongly resent that.
Arsenic?
Arsenic is an ant poison, yes, sir. All I know is I had an ant problem, and I took care of it as best I could.
Well, I questioned Swango for more than 3 hours.
Oh, can I get some more water, please? I'm really not tired. I'm not tired. I'm just thirsty.
He was very cheerful, relaxed, friendly. Of course, he never admitted poisoning anyone, so there was no answer to everyone's question.
Why? What did he have to gain?
Swango was friends with most of the paramedics he poisoned. He'd worked with them for years while putting himself through medical school. His fellow paramedics say Swango was often strange.
He was always talking about death and destruction. And
he'd collect clippings from newspapers all over the United States and on disasters and fatalities.
And do what with them?
He'd put them in a scrapbook.
One he entitled Trauma on the Highways. It was nothing but car accidents, trailer trucks smashing into cars.
It was simply a scrapbook. That's nothing more, nothing less.
The McDonald's massacre, he thought that was great.
That summer, a gunman had walked into McDonald's in California and killed 21 people.
He turned up the volume as loud as he could and just stood there and watched the TV about 3 feet away.
Make a room, please. Make way, make way.
And as soon as the program was over, he turned around and just jumped around, looked at us, just started clapping and laughing. He goes, man, wouldn't it be just great just to be there and see it all?
In prison, Swango behaved well and was out in 3 years. Now, you might think or hope that a young doctor convicted of poisoning people wouldn't be allowed to go on to treat other patients.
But Swango has gone on to hospital after hospital, hired by fellow doctors who didn't bother to check the most basic facts of his past. Let us tell you more about what they could have easily found out.
When Swango was arrested for poisoning the paramedics, local authorities did a background check on him. They were astonished to discover that the year before, when Swango was an intern at Ohio State, he'd been suspected of causing several patient deaths, but that the hospital had conducted its own investigation and then kept it quiet, not even telling its own police force. There were 7 deaths on the floor where Swango was assigned. The normal number is 2 or 3. 2 others almost died with symptoms that could have been poisoning. Rena Cooper was one, and she's convinced that Swango tried to kill her.
As he came around the foot of my bed, he inserted something with his face still averted from me. A liquid, I guess.
She then felt a paralysis, she says, that started at the IV and quickly moved up her arm to the rest of her body. She had trouble breathing.
There was no feeling in my arms or body. A voice said, when it reaches your other elbow, you'll die. And I shook the bed rail with my right hand, which was already resting on it, violently. And that's the last I remember.
The patient in the next bed saw Rena struggle and screamed.
And it was her screaming that saved me from dying.
She was resuscitated, and they asked her what happened. Because of her breathing tube, she couldn't speak, so she gestured for a pencil.
And I wrote this note. He put something in my IV. If it hadn't been for the note in my medical records, they would have said it never happened.
She says that because the hospital's investigation of the incident has led some people to believe that Ohio State didn't really want to learn the truth. And above all, it didn't want anyone else to hear claims of a doctor poisoning people at their hospital. The hospital never called the police. Instead, it conducted its own investigation and kept it quiet.
We should have called the state police in.
But University Administrator Donald Boyanowski was a member of the committee that investigated the alleged poisoning.
You know, if you went to a police station and said, I've got 2 witnesses that this guy tried to kill me, there would have been a criminal investigation.
Instead, Ohio State called in their lawyers and asked 2 doctors to investigate. Swango gave 3 different stories about what he was doing that night, but they never asked him to explain that. They did question Rena Cooper and said she gave a description that didn't match Dr. Swango.
I don't think I said that. I think at that time, words were trying to be put in my mouth.
No one ever checked Rena's IV. In fact, they never even kept it. In the end, the hospital simply ruled that she'd had a seizure and that she was confused about the incident. Ohio State did tell Swango he couldn't continue his medical education there, but the university recommended that he be licensed to practice medicine. One of the doctors who investigated him went on to describe Swango's relationship with patients as good. That doctor refused to talk to us. The university says its doctors acted in good faith and did all they could because they couldn't prove that Swango had poisoned anyone.
Think he killed people?
Yes, I believe so, yes. Proving it
I can't.
Former Ohio State Police Chief Peter Hernt only found out about Swango after he left Ohio and poisoned the people in Illinois.
I think he's very unique, but very, very sick.
Hernt's investigation lasted more than a year. Bodies were dug up, but by then the trail was cold.
I did not do these things. It is simply beyond the sort of person I am to even think about doing something like that.
It's hard to believe you.
Well, I'm sorry if that's the case. But that doesn't mean I'm angry with you that you don't believe me. I wish you would, but I have no bad feelings about that.
Do you know some people are scared of you now, about your getting out?
I'm sorry about that. There's certainly no reason for anybody to be scared. None whatsoever.
By 1992, Dr. Michael Swango's medical career seemed to be over. He'd been convicted of poisoning his coworkers in Illinois, and he was suspected of murdering patients in Ohio. But as you'll see, this charming young doctor with a taste for death had some shocking plans for his future.
You'd like to practice again?
Well, I'm certainly, keeping up on medicine. Certainly, I'm keeping all my options open in that way.
Once he was jailed, Swango lost his license to practice medicine. But he found a way around that. In some states, medical residents don't need to be licensed to work in hospitals, so Swango applied to medical school's residency program. Then, in 1992, he got a job as a resident at the University of South Dakota Medical School. Once again, he was Dr. Swango and treating patients. He'd been working here 5 months when, by coincidence, a cable TV channel reran a version of that report on Swango. As Dr. Swango prepared for his trial for poisoning the... Suddenly, lots of people were calling the hospital.
The immediate reaction was, boy, let's make sure that he's not touching any patient and let's get him out of here. I think that then you begin to think, how could this have gone wrong?
Good question. Dr. Robert Talley, dean of the medical school, investigated and found that Swango, in explaining the gap on his resume, had told the university that he'd been convicted of poisoning people, but said he was innocent, that it was a miscarriage of justice, and they believed him.
He really sold the program director and others that on himself.
He's very convincing. Some call him a genius. They say he has a genius-level IQ.
He is a very personable individual.
So personable that they never checked out his story. The word of a charming felon was good enough, until our story reran. Several suspicious deaths at University Hospital.
This film airing made action absolutely necessary and right away.
I've been telling the truth all along.
Swango fought to keep his job, going on local TV to argue that he'd harmed no one in Illinois or at Ohio State, that he was the victim. The university wasn't convinced.
Committee, Michael Swango has been dismissed as a resident in the program.
Swango left South Dakota and turned up 7 months later in New York State, where he got a job at this veterans hospital in Northport, Long Island. He was a doctor again. In 1993, one of Dr. Swango's first patients at the VA hospital was Dominic Buffalino. He just had a bad cold and a fever, says his brother, Andrew, but the family wanted to play it safe.
I thought he would be admitted to the hospital and he would be fine.
The next morning, Dominic's wife, Teresa, was shocked to get a call from Dr. Swango telling her her husband had suddenly died.
He wasn't that sick. He just wasn't. You don't think he's going to die.
3 months later, Baron Harris was admitted with pneumonia. Harris's wife, Elsie, says her husband was cared for by a very nice doctor who called himself Michael Kirk.
He was the type of person you would take home to meet your daughter. That's how nice he was.
Then, mysteriously, Baron slipped into a coma. 2 days later, says Elsie, she walked into Baron's room.
And there's Michael Kirk and my husband's neck giving him an injection. And I had asked him, what are you giving him now? And he told me vitamins. And when I had mentioned this to one of the nurses, she says to me, the doctors don't give injections, only the nurses do. I have to be mistaken. So I said, no, I know what I saw. And they just dropped it.
That same week in South Dakota, Dr. Talley got a call from a friend of Swango's ex-girlfriend telling him that Swango had gotten into yet another medical school. Dr. Talley quickly called the man who was then dean of the medical school at the State University of New York.
As soon as I hung up the telephone, I checked the records, and sure enough, Michael Swango was a resident in the psychiatry program at Stony Brook.
Dr. Jordan Cohen discovered that a Michael Swango had applied for the residence program, and after he'd gotten the job, changed his name to Michael Kirk. Kirk was now assigned to the VA hospital.
So how did he get hired?
Well, it was, I think, a clear indication of what a psychopathic personality can do to convince people that he's for real. Remember, he was in a psychiatry program, which means that he was interviewed by trained psychiatrists. And even under those circumstances, this, what I would regard as a maniac, was able to, with his cunning, convince them of the truth of his story.
Again, Swango admitted to the doctor who hired him that he had a conviction, but this time said it was for a barroom brawl in his younger days. Once again, the hiring doctor believed.
What did the doctor say when you said, why didn't you check?
He had no explanation. He said it was just an error, an oversight, that he was so convincing, he was so believable, that he didn't have any cause to doubt him.
Is it really so easy for a doctor in training with a criminal past to be hired somewhere else? Well, universities do check medical school records and internship performance, but employers need not include their suspicions that an employee poisoned people. The old tradition of blunt, honest job references has just about been killed by the fear of being sued. Prosecutor Morgan suspects that's why Ohio State didn't call the police.
Well, why wouldn't they want to find out what happened? Punish a possible killer.
They were very concerned about the legal profession and lawsuits.
So Elsie Harris knew nothing about Swango's past until he was fired and the truth hit the papers.
I mean, his picture right on the front page.
Her husband never regained consciousness. He died a few weeks later.
This man took away my life. I have a quiet house. I have an empty bed and a broken heart.
Baron Harris was the sixth mysterious death linked to Swango. With suspicion swirling around him and the FBI now on his case, Swango hit the road again. So Dr. Cohen took a step no one else had taken. He sent a letter to every medical school in the country, warning them about Swango.
I think we must assume he'll try yet again. He called him a psychopath.
I fear that he's going to, if he has a chance, continue to try to work his evil ways.
By 1995, Swango was just about as far away from New York as you can get. He'd gotten a job at this hospital in Zimbabwe. Swango had arrived in Africa during a doctor's strike. Help was urgently needed, and he was welcomed. Kanayas Muzaziwa says he went to the hospital for a leg ailment and almost didn't make it back home to his wife, Alima. He says one day at the hospital, he awoke to find Dr. Swango at his bedside with a syringe.
Dr. Swango gave me an injection, waved bye-bye, put the syringe in his pocket, and left.
Kanaya says he suddenly felt himself becoming paralyzed.
My body went numb, completely. I couldn't talk and had difficulty breathing.
Swango denied injecting him, but nurses were suspicious. The hospital fired Swango and put him under investigation for the unexpected deaths of 5 patients. Swango stayed here in Zimbabwe to fight for his job. He moved in here in 1996. His landlady didn't know much about her guest, except that he called himself Mike Swan. Fearful of Swango, she's asked we not use her name or show her face. But back then, she found him charming.
He was very interesting to talk to, widely read.
Eventually, his peculiarities emerged.
He seemed terribly interested in serial killings, and he seemed particularly interested in Ted Bundy, about whom I know nothing, but he was apparently an American serial killer whom no one had suspected.
Mike Swan also liked talking about the O.J. Simpson trial.
You could tell he was absolutely delighted that nothing could be proved against O.J. Simpson.
Police in Zimbabwe were trying to build a case against Swango when he left the country.
I'm very relieved he's not in the country, and if he returned, we would all be scared.
He went to work in Zambia next, but his life on the road ended when, on his way to Saudi Arabia to work in yet another hospital, he stopped in the United States, and customs officials noticed there was a warrant out for his arrest.
Even though Swango had been linked to 11 mysterious deaths, prosecutors didn't have enough evidence to charge him with murder. So he was charged with lying about his criminal past to the State University of New York and sentenced to 3 years in prison. When we return, the race to build a murder case against Dr. Michael Swango. When Dr. Michael Swango received a 3-year prison sentence for fraud, investigators began hurrying to build a murder case against him. Bodies of his former patients were exhumed and tested for poison. And then, finally, after more than a decade of suspicion and just 1 week before he was scheduled to be released, prosecutors found the proof they needed. Prosecutors say they discovered poison in the bodies of Swango's former patients, including 3 patients at the VA hospital in New York. One of them was Thomas Samarco.
He saw the doctor and he started screaming. He's a murderer. He's trying to kill me. I'm not crazy. And we didn't listen to him.
What are you giving him now?
No one believed Elsie Harris either. She says she saw Swango give her husband an injection. Swango told her it was just vitamins, but investigators now say they found poison in her husband's body, put there, they believe, by Dr. Swango.
I don't know if he enjoys seeing people die, if he enjoys the family's grief.
The VA hospital was just one of Swango's many stops. According to prosecutors, he's been killing people since 1984, right after he graduated from medical school.
Instead of using his medical license to become a healer, Swango embarked upon a career as a killer.
Authorities now say Rena Cooper had it right when years ago she said Swango injected her with something that paralyzed her temporarily and almost killed her. The lady in the next bed reported it, but doctors didn't believe her.
I think it's a shocking failure of the system to protect patients from a psychopathic physician like Dr. Swango.
For 2 years, Pulitzer Prize-winning author James Stewart followed Swango's trail, researching a book on the killer titled Blind Eye: How the Medical Establishment Let a Doctor Get Away with Murder. Stewart's book lays out evidence that suggests Swango has killed 35 people, maybe more. And Stewart believes that Swango is a psychopath who won't be changed by a few years in jail.
One of the chilling things about this kind of personality is that there is no known treatment. There is no psychiatric procedure, there is no drug, there is no way to stop him.
In September of 2000, Dr. Michael Swango was sentenced to life without parole after pleading guilty to poisoning 3 patients. We've just looked at 2 killers who repeatedly managed to evade the law. Let's turn now to what may be an even more unlikely story of justice delayed. In 1998, a Rwandan pastor accused of masterminding the slaughter of his countrymen found a haven from prosecution right here in America. Texas is known as a state that's tough on crime, but for more than 4 years, Texas was a safe refuge for a man who's been accused of helping to kill hundreds of people. His name is Elizafan Intakarutamana. He's a Christian Hutu pastor from Rwanda, and according to international human rights groups, in 1994, during a month-long outburst of ethnic violence in which Hutus massacred more than 500,000 Tutsis, Intakarutamana lured Tutsis into his church, where they were slaughtered.
2 people even told us, both Hutu and Tutsi, that he read the list of key Tutsi who were supposed to be killed first in the course of the slaughter.
But after fleeing Rwanda, Intakarutamana was able to take up refuge in Laredo, Texas, and live freely with his family by his side. His son speaks on his father's behalf.
More than 70% or more of the people in Rwanda know my father didn't do any of those things.
Former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark became Intakarutamana's lawyer and was firmly convinced of his client's innocence.
Genocide and violations of crimes against humanity are serious charges. There's no factual basis for them is the problem.
But others disagreed. And in 1996, after the United Nations asked the U.S. to turn him over for trial in Africa, Intakarutamana was arrested by the FBI. Then he was released by a U.S. judge who found that there was no treaty to permit his extradition. This decision outraged both human rights groups and the Clinton administration. But it was eventually reversed. And in January of 2000, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright signed papers ordering that the pasture be surrendered to an international war crimes tribunal. In the meantime, he'd enjoyed almost 4 years of Texas hospitality. Why are some criminals, even violent criminals, able to take advantage of our legal system, seemingly with ease? Here's Professor Arthur Miller.
The criminal justice system is a very human process. At every step along the way, you are dealing with human beings performing human tasks. The result is that mistakes will be made. There are inevitably going to be cracks and people who fall through those cracks. All you need is a filing error or some wrong or misdirected data. And remember, the people who operate the system are civil servants. They are often horrendously overworked and underpaid, especially in parole departments. Another issue is mobility, the ability of people to move freely and quickly anywhere in the United States. Unlike many countries, we do not have internal passports. People can simply disappear and resurface somewhere else with a new identity. There's no easy way to track an individual's movement, especially in a society that values civil liberty. Finally, there's a problem of scale. We have one of the largest criminal justice systems in the world. On a per capita basis, we imprison more people than just about any nation. It's simple mathematics. When you combine the sheer number of people who have to be processed with the imperfections of a bureaucracy, you're going to have mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes will be tragic. It can't be justified, but it can be explained. And given the inevitability of these mistakes, it's not surprising when one comes back to haunt us.
I'm Don Daler. Thanks for being with us. Join us again as we look behind the headlines at crime, punishment, and the law on the next edition of Justice Files.